Well, hello Randy's readers. You're a select group of people. And as I say, thanks very much, Randy, for inviting me on. Now, anybody who hasn't heard about me on the Apollo Moon Hoax circuit, I started investigating Apollo about 25 years ago. I'm based in the UK, I live in the UK. When I started, I couldn't find any pictures about Apollo, except in the books and magazines which I'd already assembled, but they weren't particularly what I wanted. I had to go to an astronomy show and buy a set of postcards. They were quite adequate because I'd heard a talk given in Glastonbury by somebody who was talking about photographs, and he mentioned the Apollo photographs, and he said almost in passing, he said, oh, of course, those weren't real. You know, just look at them, you'll soon see that they were taken here on Earth. So I thought, what's he talking about? Because at that time I believed everything that I'd been told about Apollo. Anyway, I went out and got some photographs and looked at them, and having trained as a photographer in London in the 60s, I knew what photographs should and shouldn't look like and what film could and couldn't record. And the more I looked at these Apollo photographs, I realized there was a major problem. And so I started investigating it in more detail, and then I discovered, of course, there were not just problems with the lighting on the photographs, but the camera that was used, the Hasselblad camera, had no viewfinder, it was manual control. Now this all may sound very 20th century to people who are not familiar with a film camera, because that's what we're talking about, film camera. We're not talking about digital cameras, they hadn't been invented back then. So I thought, well, let's just have a look and see if I can prove this chap wrong when he says the photographs weren't taken on Earth. But 25 years later, I'm still trying to find out what actually happened. I think we've gone a long way down the road to discovering what actually happened, and Randy's done a great job on writing about it, especially his new book. That's even better. So, having looked at the photographs, having decided that yes, there was a problem, I then looked into more detail about Apollo and found out it wasn't just the photographs, but how on earth did they take the photographs? Because then I discovered about the radiation, the Van Allen radiation belts all around Earth. I knew enough about photographic film to know that radiation can affect photographic film. I thought, well, why weren't they damaged by it? Were they protected? No, they weren't. So the more I discovered, the more I researched it, and the more I got intrigued by this idea that what everybody believed is that Apollo landed 12 astronauts on the lunar surface in 6 missions. 9 missions went to the moon. 3 of them didn't land, Apollo 8, 10 and 13. But we're told that 12 astronauts walked on the lunar surface. And I thought, well, okay, how did they do that? What did NASA have to do to provide the astronauts with to protect them? Because obviously the moon, there's no atmosphere, there's no protection from the sun. You're either in high temperatures or in low temperatures. So what protection was offered? None. So the more I discovered about this, the more I became aware that the Apollo missions were more than likely to have been fabricated. Now, as to why they might have been fabricated, that's a different story, but it's to do with political influence and the Cold War at the time. If you recall, late 60s, early 70s, America was involved in not only the Cold War, but the space race and the Vietnam War. So they had to have something that was going to go well for them. And the Apollo landings were the obvious answer. And that is really what it all began, where it all began. Because if they were not as portrayed by NASA, and NASA are forever telling us how they did it, they're always producing, on every anniversary imaginable, they're producing yet another set of wonderful pictures of how we landed men on the moon. The 50th anniversary has just occurred. 2019, the 50th anniversary of the landing of Apollo 11. Next year it'll be the 50th anniversary of the landing of Apollo 17. And then we might get a bit of a respite when they decide to go back to the moon. If they didn't go in the first place, how are they going to get back? Well, just use the technology they used back in the 60s. That should work. Worked then. No, won't work. So they will be followed very closely by people like yourself, like Randy, like many other people around the world who are intrigued by the whole Apollo question as to did they actually do what they said they would do. And for 25 years I've been researching it, examining it, giving talks on it, interviews on it. I've been on television in the UK and the US, in Israel, in Germany, in France, in Russia. They're fascinated by it over in Russia. Of course, they don't believe it happened. Going along with the old Cold War thing, that they would disagree with anything America did. No, they've examined the Apollo record, because now researchers in Russia have unlimited access to the Apollo archives. They've examined it and come to the conclusion that not only were the rockets unlikely to have achieved what we were told they did, but that the Russians were quite open about why they didn't go to the moon. Because they actually had a rocket, it was called the N-1. That was the Russian or the Soviet Union's rocket to go to the moon. And they had a capsule to do it in. It was all set up, they had astronauts trained for it. But they said, no, we're not going to send men to the moon until we can ensure their safe return. So they obviously knew there was a problem. Getting to the moon actually isn't that difficult. It's been done for a long time. The Soviet Union were the first to do it in 1959 with an unmanned craft. Other people have done it. The Americans have done several unmanned crafts. So getting to the moon isn't a problem. The real problem is getting humans back again alive on television. Because America made probably the most silly mistake they could have done by saying they would broadcast the whole event live on television. Yes, how was that going to work? Assuming that you can broadcast from the moon on live television, which is highly unlikely, in fact it's impossible, for technical reasons, anybody who's an electronics engineer will be able to work out how you can transmit live television signals from the lunar surface to Earth. When the moon is rotating, the Earth is rotating, both are moving in relation to each other. Unless you've got direct line of sight, you're not going to get your pictures.
Yeah.
Which is what you have to do here on Earth. You have line of sight for transmission. And they couldn't have line of sight because they didn't know the rotation. Anyway, aside from that, so why did they make the stupid mistake of saying they're going to do it live on television? Because they wanted the world to see what they were going to do. So how were they going to ensure that no untoward events occurred live on television? They'd fake it.
Yeah.
Now, I've seen gorillas climb the Empire State Building in King Kong, 80-foot gorillas. I've seen kids being chased around kitchens in Jurassic Park by dinosaurs. Is that real? No, of course it's not real.
Yeah.
It's the film industry at its finest.
Yeah.
I've seen men walk on the moon. Is that real? Now, can you prove it's real if you say that it is? Can you prove it? And if you ask somebody, all right, prove to me that the Apollo missions are real, what is the evidence you would put forward to support the contention that the Apollo missions were exactly as happened, as described and written up in books and films and TV programs forever? What is the evidence you would put forward? And most people will say, well, there's the photographs, there's the rocks, there's the reflectors, there's the fact that the Russians didn't blow the whistle on them. The next question is, well, how did they get back from the moon? Because going to the moon, as I say, is not a problem. You can see where it is, and you aim your rocket for the place the moon will be in 3 days' time after it launches. Coming back, you come back into the Earth's atmosphere at the same speed you leave Earth at, which is Earth escape velocity, which is 25,000 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Or 40,000 kilometers an hour, which is very fast indeed. Spacecraft don't have brakes, so you've got to slow down. How do you slow down? You use the Earth's atmosphere, the frictional resistance on the craft, to slow it down. So how do you stop everybody cooking inside their spacecraft? You have a heat shield. And the heat shield is made, we're told, of ablative material, which is material which will destroy itself and protect what's behind it. How did they know it was going to work? Because the very first time an Apollo spacecraft was launched with humans inside it to the moon was in December 1968 on Apollo 8. It hadn't been tested at that point. So you've got all these problems which are now coming out and being questioned, and NASA are not addressing the questions people are asking. I actually asked them, I said, could these same spacesuits be used by technicians to go into nuclear power stations and clean up the mess if they protected astronauts on the lunar surface from the radiation in space? And the manufacturer of the spacesuit, who I addressed that question to, said, you better put your question to NASA, because we built them according to the specification NASA provided to us. So I did. I'm still waiting for the reply.
You know, Marcus, I really like that point you brought up regarding, you're actually talking, I think, in reference to Fukushima explosion, power plant in Japan. And that's an excellent point. I mean, here they had a serious situation with radiation. I mean, it was off the charts, off the scale. NASA seemingly had a solution to the problem, but yet refused to provide that solution, which I thought was very telling. I mean, it's just one of many aspects that have come out over the years. It's, also, when you were talking about the reentry, I wrote a section on that in chapter, I think it was chapter 5 in my new book.
Right, yeah.
And there were some very interesting things that came up about that. And I sort of went another way, but a theme that came up, which is a recurring theme, is, and as you just touched on that, is the minimal testing that was done. I mean, we saw that with the F1 engines. We saw that with the Saturn V. And now we're seeing that with reentry. I mean, there was next to no, practically none. I think there was maybe 3 or 4, and even 2 of those tests, these are unmanned tests for the reentry procedures, were almost written off. I mean, they were that catastrophic. And yet then it's ended up Apollo 8, of course, the first manned mission of the Saturn V. And everything just worked perfectly. I mean, it's just amazing.
Well, they told us it worked perfectly.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is what one has to preface this is, because it's very easy to take NASA's story, because it's NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, venerable institution. They obviously told the truth. That's their purpose. They're a scientific organization. And science is about a search for the truth. So NASA wouldn't lie, would they?
Of course not. We all know that.
Of course they wouldn't lie. Well, NASA may not lie, but there are plenty of people around who will do it on their behalf if asked.
Yes, and that's true. And I'm sure, Marcus, that you've had many examples and many situations and scenarios where you've come across people that are lying on behalf of NASA. And I just walked into this 2 years ago. I remember you said something 2.5 years ago when I published my first book, that a whole new world is going to open up, and it did. And it's been a very interesting couple of years in terms of the NASA propaganda, the lies, the people coming forward to defend NASA. It's been very interesting.
I'm sure it's been quite an education from somebody who knows what they're talking about, like you do. I mean, that's what attracted me to your book when you published the first book. Your previous life as a flight instructor implied to me that you knew about navigation over distance, which is what we're talking about with Apollo, navigation over distance. And your bemusement at how on earth they managed to do it, given the equipment they had, lining up those grids in the lunar module window.
That's actually what attracted me to this in the first place, was that actual scenario and Apollo 13, and that's what attracted me. I remember that was about 25 years ago, until I think it was Commander Jim Lovell was talking about after they came around the back of the moon, where they're going to use the moon as a gravity assist, a slingshot maneuver. The new generation not familiar with that. Apollo 13 supposedly had an accident on the way to the moon, and they were using the lunar module's propulsion system to get them back to Earth. They had to continue on and use the moon as a gravity assist to shoot them back to Earth. But when they came around the other side of the moon, they had to aim the ship properly to reach that narrow corridor, as you were talking about earlier, for that narrow entry into the Earth's atmosphere. And you have a really excellent description. Well, you used a really good analogy.
Okay. If we look at returning from the moon, you're traveling at 25,000 miles an hour. Very fast indeed. You've got to slow down. You mentioned the particular window. It's 20 miles wide and 7 miles deep. So it's a relatively small window. Now, if you scale that down, coming from the moon, that is the equivalent of you standing at the top of the Empire State Building in New York with a 1-inch ball bearing, dropping it, and me at the bottom of the Empire State Building holding a 3-inch diameter bowl and catching that ball bearing 7 times in a row. Now, how many people who go to Las Vegas can throw 6 sixes in a row? The odds are hundreds of thousands to one against, millions to one against. It is virtually impossible.
Yeah.
So coming from the moon, without the ability to slow down or alter course, because you're going too fast, you've got to enter this very short, narrow window at a specific angle to the Earth's surface, 6.5 degrees to the Earth's surface. So you're coming in very fast. You've got to hit this first time. If you miss it and come in too steep, you hit the Earth and you're dead.
Yeah.
You come too shallow, you bounce off the Earth's atmosphere, and you go into orbit, hopefully around Earth, and you can come back again. It's more likely you'll go into orbit around the Sun, because leaving Earth, you'll go off into orbit. So you've got to hit this window very specifically. So here am I at the bottom of the Empire State Building with my 3-inch diameter bowl, and you're dropping the ball bearing in, and I'm catching it 7 times, because 9 came back. They all allegedly came back correctly. 6 landed, 3 didn't. They all came back from the moon. So 9 times on the trot. Now, if anybody can say that that is a realistic option, I want to hear about it. Because, as I say many times, I want somebody to prove me wrong when I say no humans have ever walked on the lunar surface.
That's the point that really attracted me to this, because when I was watching this documentary, Commander Jim Lovell of Apollo 13, but he was talking about, I was saying to my colleague, when we come around the moon, when I fire the engine, whatever you do, make sure you keep the Earth in a grid pattern. Now, that caught my attention because I was thinking, and this is 25 years ago, I was thinking, whoa, wait a minute. You're using visual cues for precise navigation, 240,000 miles from Earth. Even back then, I knew that you didn't have to be off by much to be thousands of miles off course. And that's what really attracted me to that. And that's when I think that was, for me, that was the first sign that I knew something wasn't right here. So I looked into it a little bit more, and apparently when Jim Lovell was saying the grid pattern on the window, I think he was at that time referring to the lunar module window.
That's right.
That was actually depicted in Ron Howard's movie Apollo 13, but that's actually not what the official version says. Ron Howard depicted it as keeping the Earth within a grid pattern in the lunar module window for optics, for theatrics. It was actually, that wouldn't have worked if going by the official version, because the ship would be perpendicular to the Earth on its plane from the moon.
And also, don't forget the other thing which has just occurred to me, that, as you say, the grid pattern is in the lunar module window, the triangular window in the lunar module. But they'd always insisted that on the way to the moon and back from the moon, they went into what they referred to as barbecue mode. One revolution every minute, or even every 2 minutes. But it meant that the whole spacecraft was moving, rotated.
Yeah, I think the barbecue mode, if I'm not mistaken, I think it did one complete revolution every 20 minutes. So it would be, I believe it was 3 revolutions per hour. Actually, I talk about that in book 1 because I factored that into their method of navigation. But just to finish the other point that you had brought up regarding the navigation back from the moon, when they were talking about keeping a grid pattern within the Earth within a grid pattern, they were actually talking about the optics, the lunar module optics. And that would make more sense, because then the spacecraft would be configured properly for the proper firing of the lunar module engine. And using the forward optics, they were able to, by this time it wasn't perpendicular, the longitudinal axis would be facing the Earth, and they would use the lunar module axis. But another thing that came to mind too was they were using the lunar module engine, which had, I think, half the thrust as the service module engine, which they couldn't use. So there were a lot of things that started coming to my mind, and I was thinking, okay, some things don't add up here. I let it go at the time, but I remember, several years later after that, I started taking it a little bit more seriously, and I started looking into it a bit more. And that's what led to the chapter, Navigation. Yeah,
very interesting chapter it was. I'm no expert on navigation, but I can understand the theory behind it and what you were referring to. I mean, my expertise is more in the photographs and the cameras.
Yeah, your expertise was absolutely amazing. And there's another one, too, that I've been following, in Scott Henderson's work.
Very good.
Is very good as well. And I more or less stayed away from that subject in book 1 because you have done some very good work along with Scott Henderson. And, of course, Robert Williams is doing some good work on that now on his YouTube channel.
Yeah.
But I stayed away from that in book one because a lot of that work, as I said, had been done and is still continuing to be done. I wanted to focus on other aspects of it, so I stuck more with the technological aspects of the Apollo missions. And I'm not saying that being a pilot makes me an expert, and this is, I've sort of been accused of that, and no one's an expert. I'm a strong believer that anybody with average intelligence or more can cipher through this information for themselves. Exactly. And what I've noticed in a lot of my research is that these documents and technical manuals are written purposely to confuse people.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that a lot of the authors of these technical manuals are not always versed in that subject themselves. They're technical writers.
Yeah.
And they write it in such a way where it just creates a lot of confusion among the readers, and people just can't be bothered. But you can write this in such a way where it's accessible to everyone. And it's interesting, I might just add a side note here. There's a law firm in the United States, and they're trying to start a movement to start writing legal documents in plain English.
All right.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense to me because not everybody has a law degree. Not everybody has an engineering degree, right? Not everybody has a finance degree. So, we all have our respective disciplines in life.
Yeah.
Right? So most people, their average intelligence, can access this information for themselves and understand it.
Yeah. It's basically logical thinking, which most people, if they are interested in a particular subject, they can think it through. They can say, well, if that happens, what effect is it going to have on that? Or if that happens, how will that result? It's basically logical thinking. It's not rocket science. You don't have to have a PhD in astrobiology to understand what happens to people when you put them in space. They go poof.
Exactly.
On Earth, we're used to 14.7 pound per square inch of atmospheric pressure. That's the weight of the air above us. Every square inch above us, 14.7 pounds.
Yes.
Which is 750 odd pounds per square foot, about 2 tons per square yard. So it's a lot, but we don't notice it because we have pressure inside as well as outside, so it's equal. So things that come in on us, pressure that comes in on us, we aren't aware of it, we're not affected by it. What does happen is when you reduce that pressure by climbing a mountain or flying in an aeroplane, and you go high enough so that the air above you is less than 14.7 pound per square inch. Now, at the top of Mount Everest, the pressure is 5 pound per square inch. It's not me saying it, that's a scientific fact. You can go and check it. Anybody can check it. At 30,000 feet, atmospheric pressure is 5 pound per square inch, and that is about the lowest amount of pressure that humans can survive at. At the top of Everest, it's not because there's a lack of oxygen. There's plenty of oxygen in the air around you. What the lack is pressure.
Yeah.
To force it into your lungs against the back pressure in the lungs of 14.7 pound per square inch, trying to get it out again. So it's basically being blocked. So it's not lack of oxygen. And that is a key point. It's lack of pressure. So when you walk on the moon, allegedly, you've got to carry your pressure with you because on the moon, it's a vacuum, there's no pressure, there's nothing. So in order to survive, humans have to carry their own pressure, which we do in a spacesuit. And they would have about the same pressure as the top of Mount Everest, 5 pound per square inch. But there's one piece of material which is adversely affected by the vacuum of space, and that is photographic film. Now, photographic film, which is what was used on Apollo, and was also used on the lunar orbiter, unmanned craft, was sent to photograph the lunar surface to look for landing sites in 1966. And a second satellite, which is an Earth-orbiting satellite, called the Hexagon Spy Satellite, also known as the KH-9, is part of the Keyhole series of satellites, spy satellites. And that used photographic film in its cameras. It was sent up after Gary Powers was shot down in 1960. America had to develop a new method of getting photographic information from Russia. How many rockets are they building? How many bombers did they have? All that sort of stuff. So they designed a very complex camera system to go into the Hexagon spy satellite. It used photographic film. They had about 30 miles of film stored in the space. It's quite 60 foot long. It's the size of a school bus. I mean, we're talking a big piece of kit, which is why the space shuttle is the size it is. So if this photographic film was used in space, wouldn't it have been affected by the vacuum? Now, about 3 years ago, I went to a lecture in London given by the designer of the camera used in the Hexagon spy satellite. And he said this almost as if everybody knew about it, which of course they didn't. You have to keep photographic film under pressure in space. About £1 per square inch, £1.5 per square inch, that's all that you need. But you have to have it under pressure. And he showed the schematics of the designs he'd done, and the whole of the camera system and the photographic film, which is on huge spools in the spacecraft, were housed within a pressurized container inside the spacecraft. I discovered the same thing happened on the lunar orbiter. It was all housed in a pressurized container because photographic film is affected by lack of pressure.
You're talking about the lunar orbiter that was sent up in the 1960s.
Not lunar reconnaissance orbiter.
That's later, yeah.
That's 2009.
Yeah. Okay, so you're just to clarify, you're talking about the lunar orbiter in the 1960s.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And that used photographic film.
Yeah.
Which was susceptible to radiation damage. I actually asked him the question. I said, would the same conditions apply to the film used on Apollo? Of course it would, he said. You can't use photographic film in a vacuum. Then I knew that NASA had lied because the cameras were not pressurized. You can see it. If you're going to pressurize a camera, you have to surround it by a relatively small housing, but it has to have a pressurization. It's maybe a nitrogen gas bottle, but it has to be something, and you can see it. The film cameras were not pressurized either. The Maurer 16mm film cameras shooting the scene outside from the first instance, the Apollo 11. That was all photographic film. Same thing. It wouldn't work. Basically, the film gets too brittle, and it also outgasses. There are two effects of a vacuum. One is outgassing, and the other is cold welding. Outgassing means that the volatile elements, the lighter elements inside any liquid, are removed. That's why you can put a bowl of water inside a vacuum chamber, lower the vacuum down so the pressure decreases, and the water starts to boil at about 10-15 degrees centigrade. Now, what it's doing is outgassing.
Yeah.
Because metals have volatile elements in them as well, aluminium, tungsten, all the metals, copper, they all have volatile elements which are outgassed by the savage effect of the vacuum. This is a known scientific phenomenon. It's not rocket science. It's been known about for years. As soon as anybody could generate a big enough vacuum, a strong enough vacuum, it's quite hard to do it. But if you can get a powerful vacuum, then you can see the effect of cold welding. Now, cold welding means it's basically what this thing. You can put two metals together that touch each other in a vacuum. They're welded. Can't get them apart. Whoops.
Now, I want to emphasize that point because you bring up a really, really good point here. And I also want to talk about the work that you did. You actually wrote a paper with Scott Henderson and Robin Williams on this. And for the readers, I actually wrote an appendix. I have an appendix to the book, and I put Marcus Allen, Robert Williams, and Scott Henderson's paper in there. I talk about that so the readers can refer to that. And they can, for more details, they can also refer to the allis.com website. Yeah. It's published on there. But I want to talk a little bit more about that so people understand. So what the work that the three of you have done has determined that we're limited in terms of how much of a vacuum we can create on Earth in terms of simulation compared to what the actual vacuum would be outside of low Earth orbit, for example, the moon or the lunar surface. And that with the effects of outgassing, as you just brought out, there would be obvious effects on the photographs taken with the Hasselblad camera. And since the Hasselblad camera was not pressurized, those effects should be clear, but we don't see any of that. We see crisp, clear images of the thousands of photographs that were taken. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, that's one of the photographs that were taken on the lunar surface, we're told.
Yeah.
It's of Neil Armstrong taking a photograph of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder. And you see him lit up like a Christmas tree. That's another story. But that implies that the photographic film used, this stuff, this is photographic film. This is 35mm film, plastic backed, emulsion, light sensitive emulsion. You can see the light affects it there. That's photographic film. Now, if you put that in a vacuum, the emulsion, which started life as a liquid, will outgas. Now, this has been demonstrated. You mentioned Scott Henderson and Robert Williams.
Yeah.
Robert Williams went out and bought a vacuum chamber.
Yes.
A vacuum chamber.
Yes.
To test this. And the reason that it hasn't been brought up much before this, as far as I know, I'm the only person, as well as Scott and Robert and yourself, who mention it, is because the whole construction of the hexagon spy satellite in which this camera system existed was classified. And it was only declassified, I believe, in 2011.
Yeah.
And I heard the designer of the camera system give the talk in London in 2018. So it had been relatively recently declassified. So nobody knew that photographic film was affected by a vacuum because nobody had considered it to be a problem.
Yeah.
Maybe NASA had tested it. I don't think there is much evidence that NASA actually tested photographic film in a vacuum because they couldn't create enough vacuum. Producing a vacuum here on Earth, yes, you can do it. Now, a bit of technical information. Vacuum is measured in what's called torr, T-O-R-R, named after Evangelisco Torricelli, who was an Italian scientist who developed the barometer back in the 17th century.
Right.
It was named after him. On Earth, we say that at sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 760 torr. It's the equivalent of the mercury, the level of mercury that is measured in barometers, hence the name. As you go higher and higher and higher, you get less and less pressure until you get 0 torr, which is a few tens of thousands of feet above the Earth's surface. When you get to the International Space Station, it's torr 10 to the minus 3, i.e. 1,000th of the amount of 1 torr. When you get to the moon, because the pressure can only be created by something in space, some matter in space, you get to the moon, it's torr 10 to the minus 12. And that is virtually unmeasurable.
Yeah.
It is so small. It's a logarithmic scale, not to be confused with a linear scale. The two are very different means of measuring the same thing.
Right.
But one measures much larger amounts. So torr 10 to the minus 12, that is a savage vacuum which will kill any human who comes into contact with it. But the sheer expedient of forcing the pressure in his body out, so he basically suffocates.